Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name's W1 Bob Dixon. I'm a Regimental Sergeant Major of 2 Wakefield Hospital here in Liverpool. And it's very nice to see you all here today, and hopefully you've had an opportunity to have a look through the trench and see what it was like in 1914. Mr. Parsons is a good friend of mine and is a serving warrant officer in the REMC, so he's very well suited to be doing that kind of presentation. If you've not had the opportunity, you certainly will do once you finish this presentation. And then it goes through to 2014. We're pretty much going to talk over that today. So effectively, the presentation will be in 4 parts. I'll talk a bit about the First World War, not too much in depth, just to give you a taste of how we set up in the First World War. Then I'll pass you on to Staff Sergeant Gary Dwyer here. We've known him for many years, since he's a wet behind here, certainly a wet behind here, private soldier, and to one of the finest, I must admit, he's one of the best instructors, military instructors in our corps at the moment. So very, very nice to have him here today. Guys, you want to take a seat to the back there, mate? So what we're here for, the title says, from the trenches to Helmand, so that's exactly what you're going to get. But I'm just going to read a few points out first before I babble on there, because that can go on for absolutely hours. So if we get too long there, that's why Gaz has got the rifle so he can just shoot me and carry on with his presentation. So the differences of the campaign, notice there, this should be fairly clear. The First World War was a large-scale European conflict that eventually went global. Lasted 4.5 years and cost Britain their empire. There's almost 1 million men. You just can't really quantify that nowadays. As the other, we're engaged in a hard-fighting campaign with the coalition forces against a very well-determined and motivated enemy. So we've been there for almost 13 years now with the loss of 450 British service personnel. So there are similarities between the 2 campaigns as well when you compare them. Prior to both campaigns, we've both been well-trained, ready to deliver, to go into a campaign. But both times we've been found we need to change how we do our business to come out the other end. So both times we've got in pretty much prepared for what we want to do. We've had to make those changes along the route. We've both come out the other side, very different than when we went into that campaign. And that's one of the good things, the technological advancements that came out of both conflicts. It's certainly going to inevitable changes the way we look at things there, and it potentially changes the way we're going to go into the next conflict if we have any. And the way I look at it is we have a certain cycle, and the way I look at things there, we have a period of reflection. We reflect what's happened in the campaign. Then we have and see what lessons learned from that. Then we go into the development phase. So what can we do better? Let's trial a new kit. Let's get it in there. Then the testing phase. The testing phase, really, the best part to do it is in the field. In Afghanistan, as we're doing it now, trying a kit out there. And sometimes it might be trial and error, but we've got to try these things out there, and hopefully we'll get it right. I use some of the references today, and I use the 63rd Field Ambulance, which makes up 2 Wakefield Hospital as we know it today. It's one of the antecedent units. It's got a very proud heritage of Liverpool itself, but not many people really know about it. It was a unit, it was a territorial force unit that was mobilised in 1914. They had so many recruits in 1914, it expanded to create 3 field ambulances and 8 in Liverpool within 2 months of the war starting. So a supreme effort. One of the sections, so pretty much 60, 70 personnel, were students from the universities here. So they come through to us, medical students, and the majority of those deployed to the First World War, and then become the doctors to serve with the British Army. By the time the 63rd Field Ambulance had finished the war, it's one of the most hardened units of the Great War, especially for the REMC. Fought the Battle of Loos in 1915, and the Somme in 1916, where it lost quite a number of casualties. Went through Arras, decimated. They lost 60% of their strength at the Battle of Passchendaele, and we fought again during the Great Retreat of 1918 and forward to the final advance to victory in 1918. It's a very highly decorated unit. We've got many soldiers, and we have the privilege to have one of the most decorated soldiers of the REMC was a man from this city itself. But we're doing something about that because it's a project I've got to hand. He lies in an unmarked grave in Wallasey. He's one of the great heroes, and nobody knew about him until a few years ago when we started to dig into our history. Enough about that. I'd write notes there because I'm going to get a little bit older now, so I have to remember all the things I'm doing there. So I'm going to step down and step away from the stage. Talk about the REMC in 1914, a bit of a history lesson there. We're a fairly new corps. So, by 1914, we're less than 20 years old, so we've gone through a big sea change there. Our first campaign, so formation of the corps, was in 1898. From 1898, it was on 23rd of June 1898, Queen Victoria signed a royal warrant, and on the 1st of July 1898, the corps was formed. Only a very small corps, but its first test was in the Sudan of the same year. Not really much of a test for the Corps itself. It was a fairly easy battle for the British Army, and it wasn't really found wanting at all. But the test next was the big one for us, and that was the campaign in South Africa. Now, for us, we've gone into the campaign there, thought we were well trained, but in fact, we were found very much wanting. We're once again fighting a very well-determined enemy, and they caused us to get the amount of soldiers into South Africa. It was, in the end, it was 350,000 British soldiers there fighting 80,000 Boers. As a result of the expansion of the army, the Corps had to expand to be able to cope with that. It's taken a lot more casualties. There was, unfortunately, there's more casualties through disease than there was through battle casualties. So we're evolving as we're going through that. As a result, the Corps expands to more than double its size between 1899 to 1902. So it's a big expansion. We have to cope with that. The formation of the RAMC volunteers. This is one of the things that came out of the South African campaigns. And this is where Liverpool comes into effect, and our unit in particular. In 1902, the Corps had been formed for 4 years at that point. They decided to form what we call as Liverpool Bearer Companies, and that's where we can first find our heritage, particularly for our unit. There's 2 Liverpool Bearer Companies here in the city, one in Egbert and the other one in Harper Street here in Liverpool. And there was another one in St Helens, which eventually merged into be part of 2 Field Hospital as we know it today. So they were thinking about these things. They changed the way they did business. We changed it from the regimental aid posts, then we started to do casualty clearing hospitals. It was lessons we'd learned from South Africa was the most effective way to go into the next war, so we thought. The next big thing that comes on the horizon is the Haldane reforms of 1908. For a Liberal, quite absolutely very far forward-thinking man, along with Douglas Haig, think of him what you wish, but we're very lucky to have Douglas Haig as one of the people involved in that committee. He realised the problems from South Africa, and it took us a few years to get to that point. And like I say, for a Liberal government to be able to push the army and to mould the army to ready to go to war in 1914, we couldn't have asked for 2 better people to do a job. The result, in Liverpool itself, the difference was we had a general hospital. It was classed as the first Western General Hospital. Then we had the first West Lancs Field Ambulance, which was the old Liverpool Bearer Company, the second West Lancs Field Ambulance, and the third West Lancs. So in Liverpool, we've got a big footprint. They also decided a new concept called the Casualty Clearing Station, which is, eventually became 34th Casualty Clearing Station. So, July 1914, the overall strength of the RAMC, regulars and reserves, sits at around about 20,000 officers and men. So there's not a great deal in size there. Figures vary from whichever sources you take. But we go into that campaign thinking, yes, we've learned our lessons from South Africa. We'll try and evolve from there. We'll see what happens next. So the BF heads overseas in 1914. I'm not going to talk about the history lessons, but there's several generals who didn't really want to fight a European campaign. Haig was one of them. He knew it would be a long, hard fighting campaign, as did Henry Wilson, who was the director of military operations. They knew that it wasn't going to be over by Christmas. I don't know where this comes from, but they knew it was going to be a long, hard campaign. Hence why Kitchener, when he called for his 100,000 men, also knew it was going to be a long campaign, asking for people to serve for 3 years with the colours or for the duration of the war. Well, that's not over by Christmas, is it? So we've got to think about that. So the BF goes over to France. Initially, there's 100,000 men go over there. I say we've had Kitchener's call and a general expansion. The reservists get brought back in. And we talk about the battles at Mons. I was on a battlefield study recently. We talk about the old regular army at the battles at Mons. Well, majority of them are actually old soldiers who'd been out the army for some time and been brought back into the colours. The Royal Fusiliers at Nimi, 60% of their battalion had been out the army for some time and called back in there. But credit to them indeed. They were battle-hardened veterans from the campaigns in Africa and India. They were strong, robust individuals. We're going to go into the role of the field of the RAMC. It says there, fairly simple, collection, treatment, and evacuation of the wounded and the sick. That hasn't changed at all. We still do that exactly as today as we did 100 years ago. Maintenance of the fighting force and returning those to duty where possible. When you look through some of the reference books there, figures vary as you go, depends which reference books you use. But throughout the First World War, about 11 million casualties the RAMC had to deal with. 11 million. So as a result, the army expanded dramatically. So the Corps had to expand dramatically as well. So 11 million of those. 2.5 million of those battle casualties on the Western Front. How many of those returned to duty? We're actually talking a fairly decent rate, 65 to 70% in some cases that people believe. But it all depends on which statistics you look at. So it's quite a good return to work rate. And the reason is we haven't got endless supplies of manpower. We need to keep people fit and in the field. So we've got to have our doctors there. We've got to have a good chain of evacuation to make sure people are treated effectively, to give them the best chance of survival, to throw them back into the front. And that's the main effort. I touched on it before, the evaluation and improvement of care. As we found out when we went into the First World War, there's certain things there. We went through the drills. Some of the field ambulances had been taught how to do these special stretcher drills, which is really good in the field in peacetime in a parade square. But in the mud of Flanders, it was a very different game altogether. So they had to adapt. And those people, did anybody turn up for the presentation last night about stretcher bearers? It was a very good presentation last night, absolutely fantastic. And a young lady who did that will be coming back up to Liverpool again very shortly. Let's say evaluation, improvement of care, and that features all the way through, and that's still what we go through now. We evaluate what we've been doing, we develop and we test. It's that cycle that we always go through to improve ourselves within the Corps. I'll quickly flick through these. Regimental aid post level. This is effectively the first port of call you're going to come to for any soldier that's wounded. Inside there, you're going to have a medical officer and potentially a couple of soldiers from the RMC, either a sergeant or a corporal, and a couple of private soldiers. You'd also have regimental medics, we call medical assistants now, or the names have changed slightly over the modern era, but we still have men from the battalions trained as medics who serve in their aid post. But you still have some of the RMC contingent in there. Now, it was their job, unfortunately, along with the stretcher bearers, to go out into no man's land, to extract the wounded and to bring them back in there, get them to the regimental aid post. There's no real holding facility for the aid post itself. It's a bit of a tricky one. When you're in the frontline trenches, we'll go through some of the other demonstrations and show you some of the photographs. The priority in the trenches has got to be the fighting men to the front. They've got to be up there first to win the battle. Second of all, behind that, as a logistic element, make sure you've got enough ammunition, water, food to sustain the battle itself. And after all that's done, then you can extract the wounded. Once he's wounded, as cold-hearted as it may sound, he's of no use to you whatsoever at that moment in time. He's potentially clogging up the trenches as you're trying to get him back. And that's it. When there's thousands of casualties, you've got to get them fighting men forward. And that's some of the issues that people had to deal with. Stretcher bearer relay posts. This is one of the things they brought in. They realised that in the peacetime parade square drills, carrying a stretcher is fairly easy. Just walking around there, put slings on, walk around, easy. So when you get to the undulating country of France and Flanders and starts getting bogged down, it gets quite hard. Those stretcher slings that you thought were quite good are actually cumbersome. It doesn't take 2 people to carry stretchers. And one of the books I've got there said it takes 8 people to carry a stretcher through the mud to get him back to the aid post. 8 people in one go, and only to hand him over to the relay posts. These were sighted sometimes no further than 400 yards behind the front line. And the idea was they would relay these casualties from the regimental aid post, and they would go back on to the next stage of the evacuation chain, which was the advanced dressing station. The field ambulance itself, as I mentioned, was it's not just a vehicle. The field ambulance is just the title itself. It's broken down to 3 sections. And each of those sections can evolve. There's a bearer section as part of that. Each one of the sections is subdivided into a bearer section and a tent section. So the tent section can create either an advanced dressing station or a main dressing station. The advanced dressing stations would go quite forward, potentially up to between 400 and 600 yards. Some of the books I've been reading recently and some of the research, you see that they're actually very, very close to the firing line to give the soldiers a better chance of survival. And that's what they were concerned about. They weren't really concerned about the danger to themselves. They were thinking about trying to get the men back as quick as possible, get them into that chain. Get them into that chain quickly, there's a better chance of survival. So they're being pushed forward. So they'd have one of these advanced dressing station to every brigade fighting. So for potentially in 1914, it's 4,000 men. They would support 4,000 men in the field. The advanced dressing station comprised of 67 men to support 4,000. So that's how we started off business in 1914. Then it was a main dressing station which would filter back to. The advanced dressing station didn't really have a capability to hold on to any casualties at all. Had to really do any life-saving surgery if you could, or just try and dress the wounds to try and get them back. So once you get back to the main dressing station, there was a capacity to be able to hold on to these people for a short period of time. No more than a week, I'd say. No more. It's ideally 2 or 3 days before you can get back. Depends how many casualties you've had. It's if you've got if we talk about the Battle of the Somme, for instance, the 63rd Field Ambulance said it was just absolutely horrendous. Their first 24 to 36 hours, they extracted 1,500 casualties passed through their hands alone. 1,500 casualties. And there were several field ambulances. Their sister field ambulances called up to support because they'd taken so many casualties themselves, extracting the wounded, that to get even more people to come forward to extract them. But credit indeed to be able to extract that many soldiers and to get them back into the medical chain and not to leave them out there in no man's land. Mentioned for the main dressing station was also a link. There was another point there, I've not put it on there, was a walk-in wounded collection point. If you were lucky enough to have been wounded, but you could still make your own way back, you were just encouraged to do so. You could probably get to the RAP, given a little docket. Some of the units used to give you a little bit of paper saying that you've been seen by a medical officer and you're walking wounded. Because if you're just walking back down the trenches on your own, the chances are you could get lifted and say, well, you deserve to sunshine. So they give them a little docket, off you go. If you find a few people who could walk together and help each other along, you did so. You made your way back to the main dressing station. So it's self-survival at the end of the day. So patch your wounds up and do the best you can. So you get to the casualty clearance station. Now the casualty clearance stations could be anything from 5 kilometres, 10 kilometres. There's no hard and fast rules about where we site these facilities. We learned eventually when we started taking numerous casualties about where to site them. We started making advantage of the rail networks, very important. Water, we needed to get the water networks, and with also the water, generally there's the canals. Now the canals come into some use with the barges. If you had people with several fractures and spinal injuries, what better than to put them into the boat and just nicely meander down the water. Much more comfortable for the patients instead of putting them onto a horse-drawn carriage down the pavé roads or the motor ambulances bouncing around down the roads there. So all these things were thought about. Casualty clearance stations, there was, they expanded. They could take a capacity of about 1,000 men at any one time, though generally they had to expand to even more than that. And that's why you see the pictures of the tentage set up there, and you see the rows and rows of stretchers outside there. They had to expand. They decided in 1915-16, there was a European conference of surgeons, and said, what's the best chance of survival? So started merging all of their facilities into one area. So you had certain casualty clearance stations had specialist care. So abdominal trauma was 46th Casualty Clearance Station. And they started to go with the thoracic trauma. There's all sorts of specific areas of injuries. So they pulled all these together to think, well, actually, if you've got a certain injury, you would go to that CCS because you had a medical specialist at that point. And then so if you had lower limb injuries, you go to another CCS. So you knew, once you got into the main dressing station, we knew where to be sending people to the right hospitals where you had the right technical ability to be able to deal with that. Next part is the stationary hospitals. So from the stationary hospitals, we also had there's a bigger capacity to hold people there. This wasn't a bit of a dodgy title, really, stationary hospital. It was a semi-permanent hospital. They could move around there, so they weren't exactly stationary. They had a big capacity, but it was just a staging hospital. There's also an opportunity to send people for convalescence. So that's the point there where you stop them and say, right, do these people really need to go any further back? Or can we keep them in France, get them fit again, and send them back up to the front? So this is the point where we kept hold of them. Let's go to the next one. Base hospitals. Generally, if you go to France, you go to Etaples, you see numerous field hospitals, the base hospitals around there. That was another big area where they used to hold the troops there. That was the more seriously wounded and probably too serious to be moved by ship back to England. If you were lucky enough to get a blighty wound, then you'd be taken from the base hospital, you'd be redirected onto the hospital ships, and you'd be taken back to England. Now here in Liverpool, we've just been unearthing some of the information, and it's a very proud heritage we've got here. We've got some of the most famous orthopaedic surgeons of the time working in the city. Sir Robert Jones, just a gentleman just over there in the bottom middle picture. Absolutely fantastic orthopaedic surgeon. When the war started, he eventually became the chief of orthopaedic surgery for the army and responsible for about 55,000 beds in England. And he had to go and look at all these orthopaedic cases. Any of the more serious cases, when he got to Victoria Station, were then rediverted. Send them to Liverpool. Come here. This is the best place for orthopaedic care in the country. One of the best places you can come to. And so under his tutelage as well. So it's a very famous place indeed. So a hospital ship, like I say, you've got a blighty wound. In and around the UK, there was cities were taking over. The Western General Hospital, as I talked about earlier on, from formation from a territorial force, took over effectively Liverpool. It didn't deploy into the field, which is some people think is a bit disappointing. I would have liked to have seen a historical link there in France and Flanders, but there's a reason why it didn't go overseas. The reason is because it was so full of surgeons and very experienced people. They couldn't risk those people. They were better off serving the country back here. Liverpool was effectively a 4,500 bed military hospital. So these different places were taken over around the city. Fazakerley, as certainly one of them, was the headquarters there, and that's opened up initially as a 500 bed field hospital. Wallasey Town Hall, another 500 beds there. It started off, the Western General Hospital started off with about, in 1914, with about 70 personnel. By 1918, had 2,500 soldiers on staff to support the hospital. It was a big, the city of Liverpool was just a big field hospital. The main places in and out of the city. The schematics on there for you. So just talked about them, so I'll just point them out to you. Your battalion's fighting up the front there. You've got the regimental aid post, as I mentioned. So there's a medical officer inside there with some of the medics. They're responsible for getting the men from the front lines to the regimental aid post. In between here, we can have stretcher bearer relay post, not identified in this part here. But there was, that was something that was brought in a little bit later on in the war. You see, you go to the advanced dressing stations and follow the pathway down to the main dressing station. Once again, we can have, there were quite, when we went to war in 1914, we had about 80 motorised vehicles on the strength of the British Army. So really, totally inadequate for what we were going to be doing. We didn't realise at the time it was going to be such a big campaign, so we had to expand that. But they started to get motor ambulances into the field ambulances. And one of the advantages of having a motorised ambulance there is that the horse-drawn ambulances might get spooked under the shell fire. So sometimes, if you were lucky enough, you could have had a motorised ambulance going to the front, and or you could have had some of the horse-drawn ambulances. Depends what was available to you at the time. As I mentioned about the casualty clearance station, later on in the war, they started to merge those together to give the soldiers a better chance of survival, and that's the main thing. The survival rate to get people back into the front to keep them fighting again. So ambulance trains. So that's another thing we start to expand upon in the Great War. We didn't have many to start with, but certainly by the end of the Great War, we had numerous ambulance trains. By the end of the war, about 6.5 million soldiers have been evacuated by the ambulance trains from the CCSs down to some of the base hospitals. I mentioned about the stationary hospitals and then a convalescent depot. So if we'd hold soldiers there. Once they were fit enough, we'd send them straight back up to the front there, if possible, or stay in the base areas there. Logistically, how do we keep on supporting the effort? You've seen what we do there. You've seen where the way goes from front to back. These stretcher bearers, when they were carrying the casualties down, it wasn't just a one-way journey for them, unfortunately. They had to carry that poor old man down the trenches. When he got to there, there'd be a lot of resupply to take back to the front. So they just got down there with a full kit, had to come back and carry all the kit back up to the front. So for those poor lads, it was anything up to 48 hours without break at times, just constant carrying casualties, carrying equipment forward. Skip on to the next one there. I'm just going to show you some of the pictures there. So the demonstrations that showed you in the pamphlets of 1904, 1908, and 1911, these all show 2 people per stretcher carrying it there. As you can see, to try and get people through the quagmire, to try and get back into your own lines. It's an absolute physical effort to just how many people there to try and get back. You'd have a spare, you'd have a sergeant there with him or an NCO to be with a stretcher. So potentially 5 people to carry 1 man out of the trenches, back into the regimental aid post. This is just a schematic of the trenches, how we deal with the trenches. And the next slide shows you about we'll show you now, it's about the stretches inside the trenches. So the frontline trenches at the top here goes through to the communication trenches. Sometimes regimental aid posts were dug inside the side of the communication trenches. Very rarely would they be put right into the front line, so they'd always be put inside the communication trenches. Sometimes when in the battles, it depends how the trenches were set out. As I mentioned, ammunition, men forward. There were people going forward and the casualties back. If you're lucky enough, there'd be a designated route to bring the casualties back, or more often than not, you try and chance your arm, go over the top, or try and fight your way through the trenches to get to the rear. Trenches, yeah, great design. The idea was to stop the artillery shells landing inside there and spreading a bit of love to everybody. Everybody gets a piece, the shrapnel wounds. So but the problem was stretchers, trying to turn the stretchers inside there, 4 people trying to carry one of them. Absolutely, absolutely horrendous task, and just so physically demanding on the soldiers themselves. So, schematic there. This is the regimental aid post of one of the Australian regiments in the Somme in 1916. And if you've not been outside, you'll see the cramped conditions we're trying to simulate there for the regimental aid post of the First World War. It was very, very primitive, but it was the best we could afford to do at the time. So medical officer there, try and do some life-saving procedures there before he moves on. Once again, we see just the casualties waiting around. You see an awful lot of this. There's only so many stretcher bearers to be able to cope with these, and it's prioritisation of the more seriously wounded, and probably reverse triage as well. Who's got the best chance of survival? So it's one of the decisions the soldiers have to make on the ground to determine who would carry out next. So horse-drawn ambulances. Very nice. It's further behind the lines. Very nice to be able to get onto there. The problems with these ambulances, I suppose on the mud it's not so bad, but once they get into the pavé roads, the jolting around there. So any soldiers who've had serious injuries and not had any pain relief, it was very, very uncomfortable for some of the soldiers to be evacuated by this method. There we are. So this is one of the, this is taken from Gallipoli. And this is one of because the fighting lines in Gallipoli was quite condensed, we didn't have that opportunity to further down the chain to pass them down 2-3 kilometres out of harm's way. We started to set up some of the surgical procedures, some of the operating theatres, fairly close to the front lines. It's very unusual. It wouldn't have happened in France, but it certainly did in Gallipoli. So the motorised ambulances. The American Red Cross supplied quite a number of the ambulances during the Great War, which we used to a great extent, as well as our own ambulances. So they did support us, even though the fighting force wasn't with us until 1917, going into action in 1918. They did supply some of the transport to assist us. This is one of the pictures of what the field ambulances used to use. Just occupied buildings. Nice little marker there. As I can only assume that we put a big marker there, a big red cross. It wouldn't be for any benefit of somebody standing there, but we can only assume that it's something for aerial reconnaissance. It could be used as a marker point. And hopefully, if the Germans are coming over, they wouldn't try and drop any bombs on there. At least they know it was a medical facility of some sorts. So hopefully, I can only assume that's what it was there for. Yes, they used to occupy any buildings, anything as possible. But try not to use the tentage, really. It's not going to afford you any protection whatsoever. So try and occupy buildings wherever possible. Similar to this, operating theatres, casualty clearing stations. So it's occupied buildings, just take over whatever's available to them to carry out the surgical procedures. Again, ambulance trains. We had, I can't recall the amount of trains we had in 1914. And funny if I can't remember how many we had in 1918. I do know we mentioned 6.5 million men were moved by train during the Great War, casualty trains. I'll put all these up in one go. Right, technological advancements. The artillery shells and grenades. One of the main killers of the war. 60%, 70%, or 60 to 70% of the casualties were taken out by the artillery, grenades, and HE and shrapnel. Mr. Parsons outside will talk a little bit more about that. We've got more powerful and accurate rifles. We learned lessons from South Africa. We evolved our rifles. Our rifles were aimed to fire at it's supposed to be medium range, but the class medium range is 900 to 1,400 yards, and that was effective. Today's rifles, section weapon, 300 meters. That's not exactly progress, is it? But it's designed for a purely different purpose. The machine guns, once again, one of the big killers of the war, and gas. When you look at a soldier stood up there thinking, what's the biggest mass you can aim for? It'd be the abdomen. So the abdomen, the chest is the biggest part to aim for. It's actually the smallest amount of casualties, or the least amount of casualties suffered was from the chest and from the abdomen. The majority was the head and the shoulders and from the legs. The reasons for that, when you're in the trenches, is when the artillery shells are going off and the shrapnel shells are going off there, it's spreading the shrapnel balls around, so the top part's exposed, so it's always the top part that's going to get a bit of the action there. What did we do to devise to go against that? We devised the Brodie helmet. It was called a shrapnel helmet. It wasn't designed to take a bullet full on. It was designed to be able to get any of the debris that was slowing down, to slope it away from the shoulders and from the head to give some protection. And it was to do good service through the First World War and through the Second World War as well. The machine guns, like I said, they caused a lot of during the attacks, the German machine gunners would aim from the waist down to try and immobilize the soldiers fairly quickly. And that was one of the reasons why there's so many lower limb injuries. One of the things we'll talk about that you might see outside is the Thomas Splint. Thomas Splint, once again, devised here in Liverpool. And a soldier who'd been shot in the leg and had a fractured femur. In 1914, there's an 80% chance he's going to die of that wound. But by 1918, with the introduction of the Thomas Splint, there's an 80% chance he's going to survive. Simple piece of metal with a ring on it, devised here, and it's saved thousands and thousands of men's lives. The gas, I think Mr. Parsons is talking a bit about the gas. Sorry. So by 1918, what's happened? We've got 5 million men under arms, 150,000 men in the Corps, all up, all ranks there. As I mentioned before, 20,000, that was regulars and territorials in 1914. So you can see the expansion, how we've had to cope with that, the expansion of the army, to the figures we've got there. 235 field ambulances. We started the war with 27, I think it was, 27 field ambulances. Casualty clearing stations, hospitals. We started to introduce forward surgery. Forward and fast was the idea, to get people in there to give better chance of survival. So the advancements there, as you can read on the board, there's X-ray units. There's five X-ray units traveling around different areas of the battlefields, some of the field hospitals there, take X-rays on the spot. And labs, dental units, blood transfusions. So it's one of the things that we don't think about from the First World War, but it's all the stuff that we'd learnt at, and that's the period of, this is the testing phase now. We've gone through the reflection, we've gone through what happened in 1914, we've gone through the development, we've thought of new ideas, and now we're testing it in the field. And this is what we've come up with. So from 1914, as I mentioned, we went into the campaign in one particular way, how we thought we were going to fight the war, and all of a sudden we come out of it very much different. And that's going to be, we're not going to talk about the Second World War or anything like that today. That's not our purpose here today. What we are going to do is we'll talk about the direct contrast of 2014. So, as a summary, I said we're untested from South Africa to the First World War. So we thought we'd go into the First World War in fairly good order, as how we fought our last war. That's how we should always think, really. We always think we're going to be in that direction. We fought the campaign. This is the lessons we've learned from there, and this is our new idea. And it's until we test that we can then adjust as necessary. So we've had a rapid expansion and training deficiencies. And one thing I'll say there from university students, mentioned there about the C-section of the universities, or the field ambulance is made up of university students. Not a lot of those finished their degrees. They didn't finish the med school, but they reduced it during the First World War so you can get them through there and qualify them early. So you didn't get the full extent of the knowledge you would have had initially, but such was the demand to get doctors to the front line. Some of these people passed through the system. Very capable people, and certainly by the end of the war, very, very capable. But it was initially the training deficiency, just to purely to get people out there. I mentioned the reflection, development, and testing, and that's what we do within ourselves in the military today. I said the biggest part about it, and I'm very proud about above all, we treated over 11 million casualties. We helped these soldiers out there, good return to work duty. But it was at a cost, a heavy cost there. You see there, 6,875 officers and men of the RAMC were killed during the Great War. These are men who went over the top, didn't have a rifle and bayonet to fight off the Germans, went over there with a uniform, a bag, a stretcher, and just a lot of will to save people's lives. And that's a different kind of courage in my eyes. So I'm very, very proud of how we do our business during the Great War. I'm very conscious of the time, and I'll rattle on all the time, because the next part of this presentation is going to be about Staff Sergeant Gary Dwyer. But first of all, have you got any questions for me about anything from 1914 era?
Thanks, sir. Sirs, mums, ladies and gents, that's a really no-pressure introduction from the RSM. What I'm going to talk about this morning then is draw some comparisons to what the RSM's just said and see how we've developed from the First World War. But what I'm also going to talk about is the developments that we've seen within the British Army of recent years and lessons learned that we've experienced and what we've developed on from the recent conflicts in Afghanistan. One thing I also want to talk about then is, and it kind of mirrors a little bit what the RSM just said about the training and the level of training that guys received before they went out onto the front lines, but the preparation that goes into operations these days. Now, a lot of people seem to see in the media that we go away and we do 6 months at a time out in the field, but as well as that, there's also a massive amount of training that goes in before that. And I think it's really relevant at the moment to see just how well trained the guys are before they go out and the commitment involved before they step even off the plane and into Afghanistan. So in preparing for operations then, we've got the physical and the tactical components. We've got the operational fitness. Now, all soldiers are fairly fit, okay? But when they leave training, they're incredibly fit. Once they get to their units, well, you know, people can take their foot off the gas a little bit. So before they deploy out onto the ground, we need to make sure that everybody is operationally fit. And what that entails then is they have to do a lot of operational fitness tests, okay, which is a lot more heavyweight sort of exercises, a lot of patrol weight, a lot of stuff on your back, learning to take a knee and staying in that position for a period of time, holding weapon systems, getting back up again. Things that you would take for granted, but until you're experiencing that level of sort of degradation and you're going out on patrols for at least, you know, sometimes 3 to 6 hours, sometimes even longer, then that's what they need to start training and preparing for. We also need to find then suitability and ensuring that personnel who are being placed out into locations and certain roles need to be suitable for that role itself once they get out onto the ground. And that's not saying we pick all our best blokes for all the best jobs. It's just to make sure that all the people who are going out are suitable, qualified, as well as fitness, as well as experience. Basic soldiering then, we always brush up on our basic soldiering techniques because that's the first thing we're going to draw upon once we get down into Afghanistan and we start going around on the ground patrolling. Not only that then, for those personnel who stay in places like Bastion or in fairly back locations where they're fairly safe and they're not patrolling, they still need to be aware and up to speed on what's expected of them should they come under contact or should the enemy attempt to attack the base in which they're staying. Now I've got the operational specifics. Basically what that means is every theatre is different and every theatre evolves. Okay, so once we first go into Afghanistan, the circumstances on the ground are going to change due to us being there. Okay, now that could have a good effect or a bad effect. Okay, so we don't know exactly what's going to happen. But what we can do is we can learn lessons from the people who were there previously. So I could go on a 6-month tour and it could be fairly quiet. But there could be indications that things are going to get a little bit worse after we've left. So I can feed that back up the chain of command and the tailoring, the training can then be tailor-made specifically for the operational expected when they go out onto the next operation. As, like I say, we do 6 months followed by a further 6 months. And it continues on until the operation is finished. And of course, we also have some language and cultural training before we go out because if we would go out there with absolutely no idea of what was to happen or who the people were, we'd have no chance of gaining the hearts and minds of the locals, getting them on side and letting them know that we're actually there for their benefit and we're trying to help them. Okay, then we move on to medical training. Now, once we've all qualified as soldiers and we've passed our phase 1 training, we move on to phase 2 training, which used to be in Cairo Barracks, now in Lichfield. And what we do is we go and do our phase 2 and then phase 1, our class 2 and then class 1 training. So as a class 1 medic, I'm ready to go out as a patrol medic on the ground on operations. Now once we're at that case and we're up to that qualification and standard, the only issue we've got is we get to our units and then we tend to do things like skiing, hill walking, mountain biking, a lot of things that don't really involve medical work. And we'll be off going and having fun, adventurous training all over the world. That leads to a little bit of skill fade. So before we go on ops, not only are we going to make sure that the guys are up to speed and fit and strong enough to go out on the ground, but we need to make sure that all their qualification and all their medical training is brought back up to speed. And it needs to be theatre specific as well. So the guys are aware of what injuries they're going to be exposed to once they get out there, what to expect, and how to handle those injuries. And that's what the Role 1 validation is there for. It's a series of stands over a period of about 2 or 3 days where they go through and they just get trained and then tested on everything before they go out on the ground. And they must pass the Role 1 validation before they leave. You also go over care under fire for those personnel who are going out onto the ground. They need to be aware of how to carry out their medical interventions whilst under fire and care of casualties while still in contact. We also have something called tactical field care. If we're under enemy fire and the situation means that we can't evacuate the casualty, that casualty still belongs to me. So I need to keep hold of that casualty and I need to make sure that I can stabilise him and look after him as best I possibly can while still either A, under enemy fire, or B, stuck with that casualty until I can have him extracted. And so we need to make sure all personnel deployed on the ground know how to carry out tactical field care. And as I mentioned earlier on about lessons learned, the mechanism of injury is a big one because operations change. At the start of an operation, you may see that a lot of people are being hit with small arms fire, okay? So we're looking at gunshot wounds. But later on, they may start using different tactics against us. Myself, when I moved into Afghanistan, it was more about the victim-operated improvised explosive device. So basically, a pressure plate would set off a charge, and that would detonate, wiping out whoever set off the device, normally leading to lower limb amputations, and it could also be any other penetrative injuries, upper limb amputations, depending on the severity of the blast. So we make sure that from the lessons learned, we train our guys before they go out on the ground what to expect and how to react to those. And then we also go through a course called the Battlefield Advanced Trauma Life Support course, which is pretty much one of the best courses I've ever done, and it teaches you how to do everything you need to do when it comes down to somebody being blown up or shot or burned. And it's an absolutely amazing course, but I could talk all day about that. Okay, when we arrive in theatre then, that's all the training done, and we then move off. We get onto the Herc, and we fly across into Afghan. And we receive something called the RSOI package, which is reception, staging, onward integration. And as I've said there, it's just tactical updates, and that's what we receive. We get the most up-to-date intel of what's actually happening on the ground at the time, before we go out the gate. We also have some role-specific training for those personnel, because as a unit, we may deploy. Some people will be going out to forward locations, so to a checkpoint or a FOB, or a forward operating base, sorry. Some guys will be staying behind in Bastion. But their role-specific training comes into course there, and they're taught everything they need to know and updated on everything they need to do once they get onto their further locations. And then, of course, we have a nice little range package before we go out. Now, that's not just the weapon systems that I'm carrying, it's also weapon systems that you might come across whilst out on the ground. So we'll have some foreign weapons, we'll also talk about the heavier caliber weapons. And we do that because if you're working in a hospital environment or you take an enemy soldier who's wounded, you still need to know how to operate their weapon system or the weapon system of our soldiers who use different weapons as to what I use, so we can make those weapons safe before we move that casualty onto the Mert helicopter, which again is something I'll move on to very shortly. Going back to kit and equipment now, as the RSM was saying, the guys were fairly basic out on the ground, and when you go out to the trench later on, you'll see that Mr. Parsons is dressed pretty much as he would have been in World War I. I'm dressed as I would be going out the gate on patrol in Afghan now, so there's been a few updates to the equipment we're using. But talking about the early equipment from Afghanistan, we deployed with ECBA, which was enhanced combat body armor. And that was basically a lot smaller than what I'm wearing now, with a lot smaller protective plates on the inside and to the rear, which just protected the top left of the chest, okay, covering the heart. Now what we've got is, as you can see, it's slightly bigger, a lot more bulky, and when you're giving a presentation in a really warm theatre, it's pretty warm. Uniform, boots, and load carrying. Well, when we went out into theatre then, we were just pretty much as basic as you could get, really. The boots were okay, but we did have a few issues with boots. The uniform was good, but it wasn't really suited to the environment. It was coloured for desert colour, but it wasn't really cool enough. And the load carrying equipment, well, we were still using our old webbing, and trying to put webbing on top of body armour was proven to be a bit of a nightmare, and it was being quite uncomfortable. And medical equipment, well, we've learnt lessons in the past and from civilian medicine, and we've applied them to military medicine. But that doesn't always work, and I can never really forget that lesson from when I received my very first casualty in Iraq. It was a gunshot wound to the backside, which had come out his thigh, and I assumed straight away, well, I'm a brand new guy, I've never had a casualty before. I think I put a tourniquet on it just to be on the safe side. Someone says, the doctor's on his way. I says, brilliant, okay. So he leans in, and I'm trying to get this Samway anchor tourniquet onto him. And it's just a piece of rubber, really, with a little hook on the end. I think I'm pulling as hard as I possibly could. And I would have known, if I'd have known with a bit more experience, these things perish out in hot weather, hot and dry climates. I didn't know that. And the doctor's coming, so I'm trying to get this done as quick as possible to create a good impression. I'm leaning over the casualty, and I'm pulling as hard as I can, ready to anchor it off, and it snaps. And I punched myself as hard as I possibly could in the nose. And, well, you know, lessons learned aside, that was the first time I ever had a nosebleed. But luckily enough, the doctor arrived straight away. The casualty was laughing his head off. The doctor thought it was pretty hilarious as well. And, you know, at the end of the story, the guy was okay. But, yeah, the medical equipment has come on somewhat. And I'll come on to that in greater detail shortly. Kit and equipment then with the improvements, as you can see, the Osprey system I'm wearing now has a massive big ballistic plate on the front, and again one on the rear with 2 plates either side. So I'm pretty much protected all around. I'm quite happy with this, even though it's 10 times heavier than what I was used to when I first deployed in Iraq. This is so much better. You know, we're seeing the results when guys are hit, be that blast injuries or small arms fire. You're definitely seeing the results. It's just a better piece of equipment, and I feel safer with it on my back. The MTP and climate appropriate kit, well, as you can see now, I'm not wearing a normal shirt. I'm wearing this little dry weave sort of stuff, which lets the air get through and out, so it's trying to keeps me a little bit cooler. Not in here, though, but allows air circulation. It's just better, more robust kit, but it's also lighter. Boots, well, we've got more boots than we can really shake a stick at the moment. We've got so many different boots that I'm guaranteed we've got enough boots to fit any weird shaped feet. So those of you who are thinking of joining up and you've got hobbit feet, don't worry about it. We've got boots for you. And you might be looking at some of the kit I'm wearing and thinking, really? Now, this is the combat nappy, okay? And it's really, really comfortable, especially when you're patrolling for 6 hours at a time. However, it's designed to stop a blast. Designed to stop a blast from a victim-operated device causing maximum damage to my pelvic area. You gentlemen know what I mean, okay? And there's also tier 1 and tier 2, and this is the tier 3, sorry, blast protective underwear, to say. Now, the undergarments are actually, they're a set of what look like cycling shorts, and believe me, I've seen some of the army guys wearing them as cycling shorts when they've come back from ops. It's not a nice sight. But that stops, when you step on a device, all the small grains of sand and grit, it just stops them infiltrating the skin around the pelvic area. And it's amazing. It works. I've seen it firsthand when I've actually cut the clothes off a guy, and it's just, you look at it and think, you're really lucky in more ways than one. Anyhow, and it moves on as well. We've also got the blast protection comes in the form of the ballistic lenses. We have these in goggles and in glasses form. We have better gloves, which I've had to take off because obviously I can't use them with the mouse. And the helmet itself, we've now got the new helmet, which is better designed to resist blast injuries. Of course, this equipment as well helps save us from, well, not specifically from blast injuries, but it helps save us from blast injuries to a greater degree than the previous body armor. So all in all, I feel a lot safer when it comes to the kit and equipment going out on the ground. Medical advances then. In my time, I've been in the army for 15 years, and as I say, the first operation I went on was in Iraq, and that was the first Iraq with the broken nose. And now we've seen the combat application tourniquet, which you'll see when you go outside. But I was surprised to hear yesterday that I was talking to a doctor, a civilian doctor, who said that, yeah, I've got them in our A&E, and they're orange. I was like, well, okay. And he said, that's not all we've got. He said, you know, we've got a few other items of equipment that we've developed from, or we've stolen, not like proper stolen, but we've borrowed from the army and taken the idea on board, and we've civilianized some of that equipment, which struck me funny, actually, because normally we would take our lead from the civilian medical side, and I've not really experienced in my time civilian medicine learning lessons from us. But he did say, you know, we no longer do ABC, we now do CABC, so we're looking for a catastrophic bleed before we look at the airway, before we check breathing, and before we look at circulation. So that's what we do, and they've took that on board as well. So I thought, you know, we must be doing something right. Then we move on to the quick clot and Helmand, which was two items that we used to try and stem catastrophic bleeding in the past. They were used, and they were good, and they were effective, but they were improved. And the improvement was something called Celox gauze, again, which you'll probably see when you go outside to the UAP or the RAP. And it's just a strip of gauze which is impregnated with chitosan. And that enables me, when I've got a non-compressible injury or a non-compressible bleed, how do you say this without, to push it as much as it is possible into the bleed to stem, or into the wound, sorry, to stem the bleed, and then apply pressure to that. And that'll create a clot, meaning that I can then move that casualty on and get him evacuated and stabilized. You'll see that outside, and hopefully you might even get a demonstration on it. The SAM pelvic binder then, what we were seeing when guys were stepping on IEDs, there's a lot of trauma to the lower body, obviously, and that was causing a lot of fractures of the pelvis. So what we found is a SAM pelvic binder in all casualties who step on an IED, we now apply a SAM pelvic binder. And that's basically just a device that goes from the back around to the front and clips in place and holds the pelvis and the pelvic cradle in place. So if the guy's got a crunchy pelvis and we're trying to move him or throw him over our shoulder, we're not going to cause further internal injuries, okay, because we're going to lessen that because we've got the pelvic binder in place. Moving up, sorry because I missed it, to chest seal advancements. I've seen chest seals advance quite a lot since I joined the army, but the main one I like is the fact that we used to have something called an Ashman's chest seal, which had a little flutter valve on the top. And when it was used, it basically let air out, but wouldn't let air go back in. And it would make some funny noises as the air was coming out, which was always a source of great comedy to most of us, not really. But we've replaced that now because the flutter valve underneath body armor was getting compressed, so it was no longer working. So we've got a new one called the Bolin chest seal, which I believe has now been superseded by an even newer advancement, which didn't have a flutter valve sticking out. And so you could literally put it underneath the body armour, loosen it off slightly, and the guy would still continue to breathe without causing any more damage internally. My favourite one on this list actually is the fast and the easy IO, and that's for two reasons. The fast and the easy IO are both interosseous devices enabling me to deliver fluid to somebody who's lost a lot of circulating volume directly through a bone, which sounds gruesome, and it really is actually. And if you go outside, ask staff stand to show you the equipment. It's pretty gnarly. However, what it means is when somebody's lost a lot of circulating volume and you go into capillary shutdown, their veins start to disappear. What we've got is the issue of how do I find a vein to get some fluids pumped into them. So what we've got is a little drill, which you can drill directly into the bone, and I've got something that looks like a medieval torture device with lots of needles on it, which I jab directly into his sternum, and then I can deliver fluids straight into the bone. When I saw it, I thought it was a wind-up, but it actually really works, and I've used it in practice. Another advancement, the team medic. We try to train people, just normal infanteers and other guys going out on the ground, to be a basic trauma medic. And our hope was to have a 1-to-2 ratio of team medics to normal soldiers. Team medics are realistically the guys on the ground who were saving lives. Somebody would suffer a catastrophic injury, and the first person to him would hopefully be a team medic, and that person would stop any bleeds and would have him ready to hand over to somebody like me as a combat medic. Of course, we've got the medical emergency response team, which we've seen in Afghanistan, which is that big helicopter, which is normally better equipped than most A&E departments in the UK. Drop off a guy into the back of that, and he's pretty much going to live unless his injuries are non-compatible with life. Amazing bit of kit. You're looking at normally, I've seen the best, I think it was 17 minutes was the best time from putting the call in to putting a guy in the back of a helicopter. However, it's a massive target to the enemy, so you can only call it in, it can only land when it's safe to do so. So that's where we start thinking back to our tactical field care when we're waiting for the helicopter to come out. And of course, finally, then the Roll 3 Hospital in Bastion, which was a static hospital, purpose-built, and it was just amazing. I've only been through there twice because I was a forward-deployed medic, but the hospital itself, I mean, it speaks for itself when you see the statistics coming out of the hospital. If you go into that hospital alive, you're 99% chance coming out alive, unless, again, your wounds are non-compatible with life. It was just amazing. And talking to some of the staff since I've been part of the Reserve Army as a permanent staff instructor, seeing some of the guys who actually worked in there, I can see why. The level of expertise within the Roll 3 Hospital in Bastion was just, it was on par, if not better, because we've taken specifics of what we need and certain qualifications and condensed it into one hospital. So it was brilliant to see. So the final part, because I can see some of you guys are getting a little bit bleary-eyed, the CMT roles and the checkpoints. Well, as the RSM was saying about the guys in the stretcher bearers in World War I, their responsibility was to go forward with no equipment, realistically, no body armour, just in the uniforms they were wearing, if they were lucky, with a helmet and a stretcher. We don't do that anymore. Medics go out pretty much as the infantry would go out. We try to assist the infanteers as much as possible when it comes to any firefights or engagements, and we try and just carry on as much as we possibly can. But before we even think about walking out the gate, our roles and responsibilities are encompassed by quite a few things. And the first one is the primary healthcare clinics. Sat in a checkpoint in the middle of Nari-Siraj South in Afghanistan, you're still going to experience guys coming forward with headaches, coughs, colds, really, really horrible feet, which they need to be looked after. I'm not a big fan of feet, I've got to be honest. And all the low-level sort of primary healthcare things. So no matter what you're doing, you're always on duty, because you might be getting your head down in your tent, somebody will come across and just give you a knock, say, "Doc, can you come out, fix my feet?" And it's always the way. So you're never really off duty. You do medical support to patrols. So if you're unlucky and there's more than one multiple, which is the patrolling body of men going out from your checkpoint, then you're the guy pretty much who's going to go out with them whenever they require a medic. Now, the patrols, they can either be dedicated patrols going out to seize an objective. They could be just normal GDAs, which are ground-dominating area patrols, where we go out and we try and just encourage the locals by our presence and discourage any insurgents by our presence. Or they could be main operations where we go forward either in helicopters or vehicles and we go to seize an objective. Either way, they all need to have medical support. And that's pretty much where we come in. As the combat medics, that's what we do. Second to last man in the patrol most times, and you'll just plod along as a fighting man until the time comes where someone shouts medic, and that's when you suddenly go, "Oh man," and then you've got to just change heads. 1 minute you were firing your rifle at the enemy, next minute you're on your belt buckle, crawling as far forward as you possibly can, trying to make sure you can save this guy's life. We have tactical medical advice. Now, as a senior NCO, I was called into the checkpoint command post on several occasions when something had happened in an outlay station, and asked, right, what do we do with this? We've got 3 casualties. Can you advise the medics on the ground? If there's no CMTs there, then team medics will take over. So our guys will have to give tactical medical advice. That'll be anything to do with how we evacuate the guy, if he's serious enough to require a MERT coming in, or if the guy can stay behind in a CP and then we can travel down to him and check on him later on. We've also got incident management. If the checkpoint you're in comes under attack, straight away the first thing you would do is go straight to the medical facility and start preparing to manage all the casualties coming through. That's triage them in, triage them out, and treat them as best you possibly can. Sometimes, if you've got adequate amount of team medics in there, and there's only you yourself in a small checkpoint, you might have to stand back and just take a management role and not get sucked into treatment, because if you go onto the first casualty, you never know how many more people are stacking up behind you. So sometimes you have to take an overwatch position and go into incident management. My favourite one, actually, whilst in Afghanistan, was medical reporting. Yep. No matter what happened out throughout the day, no matter what we did, no matter where we went, there was always somebody on the end of an internet or a phone or on the radio asking me numbers, number crunching. They asked me about patient satisfaction surveys once. It was good. Well, no, we did them. We put them out, and the soldiers were really, really interested in them, and they wrote some very questionable comments. Yeah. Cuddles. They needed more cuddles, apparently. Gathering medical intelligence in the local area was something I was unprepared for. I didn't actually see it coming, but when we were out on patrols, my chain of command asked me to gather intel on the local areas, see if there was any illnesses floating around, how they were using their local sort of medical chain. And it was, initially I was skeptical, but I found it quite interesting towards the end, because we saw an improvement. When I first arrived, I was having mini medical shurers with all the town elders that I could get across to. And they were telling me that they didn't like the corruption in the medical chain at the time. They were paying for prescriptions, but they were also then having to pay for the medication, and they assured me they only had to do one. And the local doctor near a place called Shargaz was refusing to see females, just outright, and it just wasn't working. Now, we did that twofold. One, because we're not there to provide healthcare for the locals. We just couldn't do it. We'd be overwhelmed. But we can do limb, eyesight, and life-saving, especially if we've been involved or I wouldn't say directly involved, indirectly involved in that casualty. We could deal with that. But we can't have people coming to our gate every 2 minutes asking for plasters, bandages, antibiotics and stuff. So we were very interested in finding out what was happening in the local area. And I did see an improvement, which I was really happy with. I just randomly stopped a guy I was told to on a patrol, stopped motorbike, got him off with the interpreter, asking where he was going. And it was the same town, Shargaz, where nobody could take their females to the doctor. And he says, oh, I'm going to the doctor with my daughter. Which doctor? The one in the local area. Who told you to do that? And he says, my father, which he meant the village elder. And the educational piece had got across to them. And this doctor had been caught out, and we'd gone in and spoke to him. And the corruption had been slightly reduced. I'd never say it's to be totally removed. But he then started seeing female patients. And we could just see a difference in the local area before we left. And I was really quite proud of that. Tearing up now, yeah. Anyway, medical education. I'm there as well in a checkpoint to make sure that the guys are educated medically. That can be anything from clean your feet to doing team medic presentations, making sure the guys are already qualified in any sort of medical trade, keep their training up to standard, and things like how to use the different stretches we've got, how to use the tourniquets that every man carries, the signs and symptoms, why we should use morphine, all those little things like that. But also, because I was pretty worried about getting blown away myself, so what I did is I got my medical Bergen out, got the guys who were the best trained sort of team medics, and took them through everything that I carried as best I could. So if anything happened to me, they just opened up my drug pouch, and inside the drug pouch was a little roll of tape that went around all the equipment, and they could read what it was, they know the correct dosages, and they'd already received the training how to fix and how to use that. Now the issue was that obviously they're not trained to use that, but if some guy comes up to me and I'm the one who sustained the injury, and he doesn't operate quite within his parameters, but he saves my life, I'm really happy with that. But it was otherwise it was good education as well. If anything happens to me and I'm not incapacitated, but I can direct him how to use that equipment, it was just there as a backup plan for me, because sometimes it was a little bit cheeky. And then we've got troop level medical training. It's pretty much encompassed by what I've just said. That's getting the guys pulled in and talking about how we're going to react to say an attack on our checkpoint, or a grenade thrown over the wall, or indirect fire. If we have a mass casualty situation, I need to pull all the team medics directly to me, and then I'll sort out that, while the Sergeant Major of the checkpoint deals with the protection of the checkpoint. So there's an awful lot of things going on. And our roles and responsibilities these days, although I've stayed kind of similar to what was going on during World War I, we've taken on a lot more responsibility now, and we need to be more robust as soldiers. We need to be out, I don't say more robust. That's taking nothing away from the guys from World War I, but we need to be more flexible. We need to make sure that we can go out and operate on different levels, and also be independent thinkers when it comes to education, and how we're going to implement the medical plan. Good. Right, well, I think I've gone quite long enough. Excuse me.